Okay, so we are live and welcoming people remotely as well as here in the chapel. We are on day 3 of our first week, and we've been talking about Saul and David and the law of the lid. So if you've been following along the first few days, or whether this is your first time to join us, we welcome all of you to our time together. So by way of introduction, for today's session, we recall that from our prior session that Saul had everything going for him when he was anointed king, that his heritage, his physical characteristics all lent themselves toward him actually becoming a great leader. But because of the lids that he had in his life and in his leadership, and in particular the interior ones, the ones that related more to character, those were the things that held him back. And we ended yesterday discussing how David, even though he did not have those same kind of privileges, if you will, in terms of his own upbringing, that he came from a much more modest home, that he was the youngest of 8 children, which in and of itself in that culture was a tremendous lid, how David nonetheless was able to overcome them. And so we want to go into that more today in our time together. Again, the law of the lid, as a reminder, leadership ability determines a person's level of effectiveness. So the more we can learn about leadership and embrace it and grow into it, the more effective we will become. So again, we have each day, we have a particular thought in mind to introduce our subject. And today, our leadership thought is this: some lids can be lifted by the leader. Again, some lids can be lifted by the leader. When we look back at yesterday's thought, it said every leader has lids, and if we just stop there, it would be kind of discouraging. But today's thought helps encourage us and reminds us that even though we all have lids, that doesn't mean there's nothing we can do about them. And so some lids, and you'll see why, especially tomorrow, why we are emphasizing the word some lids can be lifted by the leader. And so by introduction for today's lessons is this statement in the actual book, 21 Most Powerful Minutes on a Leader's Day, on page 9 by John Maxwell. He says, David was able to go far despite difficult circumstances and many limiting lids. Why? Because unlike Saul, he became a lid lifter. When you look at David's life, you see a pattern of lid lifting that helped him continue growing and keep going to the next level. And the lifting of a leader's lids not only releases his personal potential, but also lifts the lid on the potential of his or her own people and the whole organization. So in other words, as we lift the lids in our own life as leaders, there is a spillover effect into those that we lead, and ultimately our entire organization. And so that's why I get excited when I think about an organization of lid lifters and people committed to reaching their full potential as individuals and as leaders. Because of that vision, that's what would enable us to do things, see things, accomplish things that maybe we didn't even think possible. And so that's our introduction for today's session. So let's look at the lids that David lifted. First, David lifted the lid for himself. It always has to start there. If you don't lift the lids yourself, you're not going to go too far. It's kind of like when we are getting ready to take an airplane flight. We always sit through the instructions Sometimes we pay attention, probably sometimes we don't. But one of the things they always say is when the air masks come down, you always have to put your own on first, and then if you have a child or someone else, you put theirs on after. Well, it's kind of like this here with lifting lids. We have to lift our own lids first, and then that will put us in a position to lift others' lids. So first, David lifted his own lid. Then David lifted the lid for others close to him. And then finally, David actually lifted the lid for the whole nation of Israel. Talk about influence. So let's examine these three items in a little bit more detail. So first, David lifted the lid for himself. When you go back to the story of David and Goliath, we remember that David had not been involved in warfare before, at least not with other humans. He was completely inexperienced at it. And when Saul tried to give David his armor and he put it on, it didn't even work. Didn't fit. Wasn't going to do him any good. But when we read more about the story of David, we realize that although he had not fought a giant before, he had been in conflict, not with a human such as Goliath, but we understand that he had faced attacks from both a lion and a bear. And those encounters helped prepare him for his encounter with Goliath. In fact, that's what he told Goliath. I've been in battle with lions and bears. Thought I'd throw in tigers at no extra charge. But those experiences then allowed David not only to participate in this, but prepared him to win. And so because of this, David grew in valor and in confidence and in faith in God. Because as you remember, when he went to approach Goliath, he said that Goliath comes to him with a javelin and a sword and a spear, but David says, I come to you in the name of the Lord. And so David's prior experiences helped develop him and helped lift those lids of inexperience in terms of fighting Goliath, because he had fought other battles. And those other battles enabled him to have the kind of confidence that was needed, because all the other people of Israel, including King Saul, were quaking in fear at that moment. So David grew in valor, confidence, and faith in God. So there is an application to us as leaders. And here it is. To grow a department or an organization, grow the leader first. Does that make sense? If we want to see more things happen in our area of responsibility, then grow the people, and especially grow the leader. So we understand that when David lifted his own lid, that wasn't out of a sense of selfishness. It was out of a sense that it had to start there. But fortunately, it didn't end there. So going back into the story of David and Goliath, let's kind of look at a before and after as it related not to David, but to the army of Israel. In 1 Samuel 17:11, this was before the encounter with Goliath. Here's what it says. Saul and all Israel heard these words. That was when Goliath was taunting them for 40 days and 40 nights. They heard these words of the Philistine and listened to the response. And they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Let me read that one more time. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. That's 1 Samuel 17:11. Then we jump down 40 verses. And by this time, the battle between David and Goliath had already happened, and the outcome had just been determined. So in 1 Samuel 17:51, it says there, when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, guess what? They fled. They ran away. And in the very next verse, verse 52, 1 Samuel 17, now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and the gates of Ekron. So keep this in your mind for the last 40 days and 40 nights. Out comes Goliath every single day, I believe twice a day, to taunt not just Saul, but really the army and vicariously the entire nation of Israel. 40 days in a row. And they were all filled with fear. They were dismayed. They were in a bad way. But as soon as David comes and deals with the situation, because he was confident in the Lord, now those who were afraid, they all muster up their courage, and instead of being the ones running away, they end up pursuing the Philistines. What a stark contrast. That simply lifting the lid, as David did first for himself, but then for the entire army. That's a pretty awesome example. So David lifted his own lid. He lifted the lid of those closest to him, but his influence went beyond that. Because David lifted the lid for the whole nation of Israel also. You see, David embodied a belief that with God's favor, he could accomplish anything. And that attitude spread to all the people of Israel. In fact, by the end of David's reign, the territory under Israel's control grew significantly. And as I mentioned yesterday, God evaluated all successive kings of Israel on how well they patterned themselves after David. He would either say, it would either describe them as righteous kings because they walked in the ways of David, or that they were unrighteous kings because they did not walk in the ways of David. So David was always the standard bearer by which all successive kings of Israel were measured by. Talk about influence. Because a young man, believing that God was with him and for him, took on a giant, and we all face giants in our lives. And as a direct result of that incident, which greatly lifted the lid on David's life, it lifted the lid of the people closest to him and ultimately spread far and wide, way beyond even those closest to him. So that's the heart of our lesson this morning or this afternoon. And so here's the conclusion that we'd like to leave you with. Again, this is a statement directly from the book on page 10. Everyone loves an opportunity, but many people want an opportunity to come to them before they start improving themselves to capitalize on it. They think, when I get the position, I will start growing. That's doing things backward. David had it right. He grew first, lifting his personal lids, and by the time his big opportunity came, he was ready for it. And when he was confronted with a lid that he couldn't remove by himself, he allowed others to help him. On that, we'll have more to share tomorrow. And so with that, we'll leave you with today's question for reflection. And it's simply this: what lids can you lift? What lids on your own life can you lift? So take that question to heart. Think about it. And then begin to take some action. Because just in the process of lifting those lids will give you a tremendous sense of empowerment and accomplishment. And it will impact other people, and especially those closest to you. And then it will have a multiplying effect, as it did with David. And so again, the question for today: what lids can you lift? God bless each and every one of you. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and we'll be talking then about some lids that we might need help lifting. God bless you.